Hello, friends. I am so happy to be here today talking about another amazing book. In fact, an award winning book. But first, before we talk about the story, let me introduce you to John Otte. And I am so glad that you're here. I am so glad to have this conversation with you. But first, John, why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, a little bit about myself. Me in a nutshell would be I'm a Lutheran pastor and a gigantic geek, have been my whole life. There's just no way around it. Some people would think that that's not something to be proud of, but that's just who I am. Uh, Big fan of Star Wars, Star Trek, video games, all the typical geeky stuff like that. Have a wife and two kids. We live just outside of Kansas City, Missouri. And yeah, that's me.
I love it. First of all, Kansas City is one of my favorite places. I love it's just beautiful around there and lots of cool, fun stuff to do. But okay, talk about the geek thing. So my husband, we have three older kids, and then we adopted seven more. But they were raised like watching really bad sci-fi, like B-rate sci-fi, all the monsters and space travel, all the things. They like love it. My one daughter, who's 20, she just went and met William Shatner at the
Oh,
Comic
wow.
Con here in Arkansas. They had to pay, her sister paid for it, a lot of money for her to like look at him across the table and get a picture. Like they're literally on two sides of the table. Like, so our family understands geek. My sons do the cards and the video games. We do lots of board games that take 2 hours to set up. I do that with my son. So all about that stuff. But the funny thing is,
Oh, yeah.
I never read like science fiction or fantasy. And my kids would be like, Mom, you really like this. I'm like, oh, I don't know. I write historical fiction. I write Amish. Then I start reading these winners from the Realm Makers Awards. And I'm like, these are so good. So yeah. So
Yeah, we are
I'm
we are Christian fiction's dirty little secret. So
it is. It's okay. When I first went there, I met well, I've known Steve Lobby since 1994, and he's like, "Come to the dark side," and it's like there's so much light and goodness on the dark side. There's edgier themes, there's different worlds and all that stuff, but so much light, so much goodness, and the people are amazing. So
they are.
all that's all gonna start before I even talk about your book, but the book is Drawn in Ash. And then this won an award this year at Realm Makers. So it won the Sci-Fi Award. So congratulations first, but tell us a
Thank you.
bit about this. And I know that there's another book that follows. So just tell us about your world and what you were creating and all the good
Okay.
things.
All right. Well, the way that I always describe this series is it's the Book of Esther from the Bible mashed up with Star Wars.
So good.
That's just the sort of brief description I use. How I got to publishing this book is a little bit of a complicated story. The idea first came to me back in 2017.
Mm.
One of the things I do every summer is I teach at a homeschool writers conference called One Year Adventure Novel,
Oh
and
yeah.
these kids are amazing. They're so cool, so creative, just high energy, so enthusiastic. I both love it and hate it because I love being around them because I just feed off their energy and their creativity. And then I also go, holy cow! Once these kids hit the market, I'm out of a job. They're just
I say the same things. I meet them at Rail Makers. I do a lot of stuff with the Young Writers Workshop, and I will tell my writer friends, I'm like, "You guys gotta watch out! Like
yeah. Oh yeah.
they are
Yeah.
so good. It's so
They
good." So,
are. They are. And so one year I was doing a presentation on villains and supervillains and that sort of thing. And if I remember correctly, I was trying to make a point about how, the villain and the hero actually have to interact with each other, and the villain has to stop the hero from taking the easy way out. I think that was the point I was trying to make. And so, as an example, I got up on stage and I was just saying, let's say that we're doing a dystopian retelling of Esther. And so, a young lady gets caught up in a demented beauty pageant at the palace. And she gets there and she realizes, hey, all I have to do is just not do anything. And then I lose the pageant and I go home. Well, where's
mhm,
the fun in that? There's no
mhm.
story in that. So I said, so instead, what if there's the Demented Beauty pageant, and she's contacted by rebels who say, you need to stay in the pageant and win the pageant, or your sister, who we just kidnapped, is going to die. I thought, ooh, that's really, and I went up on stage and I was sharing this idea with the kids, and I'm thinking, oh, I'll just let one of the kids have this idea. They can run with it. And literally, as I'm about to hand it over to them, I said, you know what? No, never mind dibs. I want this story. I
Mhm.
want this story. I'm going to write it. They were enthusiastic, very, very, very encouraging. And they said, yeah, you absolutely should. And so I spent a while developing the world, writing the story. And what was interesting was it was going to follow the outline of Esther very, very closely. There's the shoot, the choice, all that sort of stuff, with some extra elements thrown in. And my agent at the time said, John, everybody's going to know that she's going to marry the king anyway.
Mm.
So why put us through this whole beauty pageant thing when we know when that's going to have them get married right away,
Yeah.
right at the beginning of the
Page
book?
25, by the way, because I looked
Yeah.
at it.
And so I said, sure, but that throws out most of the story. I was going to, sure, okay. So I went ahead, had them get married right away, and said, well, how does that change the story? And now it becomes this sort of slow burn, reluctant romance as these two
Mhm.
are thrust together uh, for legal reasons and, all that sort of thing. And now they're stuck in an uneasy partnership and alliance, which is a problem because, well, it's the story of a girl named Everest who practices illegal magic. Uh, and the reason why it's illegal is because King Narius's ancestor, 400 years earlier, destroyed her homeland,
Mm.
wiped out that system of magic, and now she has become queen. She has married King Narius, and now they need to find a way to work together because there are people, conspiring against Narius. They're working against him, and she's caught up in the middle of it now. And like I said, slow burn romance, lots of goofy detail. Well, you haven't gotten there yet, Trisha, but they're talking trees in it,
Oh my gosh.
and and just hill giants and all this sort of fantasy elements, but
Yeah.
layered in with science fiction elements as well. And it's just this big hodgepodge, and I love it to death. Uh, Last year, I kickstarted the publication for the book. About 100 people backed the book, and
Wow.
got that done. And now in about a month, the sequel, Drawn Through Blood, is going to be coming out, and that picks up where the first book left off. And I'm not going to talk too much about it because, number one, spoilers,
Yeah.
and, and it isn't out yet. So I don't want to say, oh, here's all the secrets that
Right. Can they
So
pre-order it? Is it available for pre-order already?
it is available for pre-order for ebooks on Amazon.
Okay.
Might be available on Barnes and Noble. I'm not entirely sure if it's percolated over there yet.
Yeah.
So they can start putting pre-orders in, but it'll be available on, I think it's December. Okay, I'm going to pull up my phone and actually check the date because I don't want to say the wrong date. It'll be available on December 14th.
Oh, very cool. All right, so cool. Well, so many things that are interesting about that. First of all, Esther. I just wrote a novel, actually a biblical novel for Guideposts on Esther, and the romance is hard because ew, like,
Yeah.
he's with all these people and he's previously married. Like it's so hard to do that. So that in itself, I like to talk about the slow burn. They just come in as this partnership, and then that grows out of it. Of course, I didn't have the liberty to do that with my novel since it had to like actually follow the Bible. But yeah,
Sure.
that there's so many complicated things about that story when you really like surface level, you're like, oh yeah, beauty pageant, marry the king, saves the day. But then you start really digging in. And so I love that you're like, okay, let's do this, but let's also do it a different world. There's different kingdoms, there's different creatures, there's different factions. I mean, there's so much going on that it just makes it interesting and fun and exactly what all the nerdy people in my house are going to love. I've hidden this book because I knew as soon as I have it laying out, they're going to grab it and want to read it. And I'm like, no, I need to interview him. So, but it's the perfect type of thing um, that they like where there's different worlds and different ideas, but it's all human nature. Like it's all, even if it's different creatures, it's often human nature our common struggles. And I think that's the fascinating part about science fiction and fantasy and any of these speculative fiction. It's the normal, not normal, but it's everyday storylines of real people in hard situations having to make decisions, having to go against enemies and friends, and you build relationships. But then there is the building on top of it. There is you talk about the magic, which is ink-based magic going on. There's so many different things that just ups the level. So it's like writing a novel is not easy anyway, but I really
Hmm.
feel speculative fiction. It's like we're gonna take everything we know about how to start the story and then have inciting incident and then have all this conflict and then you're just adding on layers and layers. So that being said, what is it like when you start working on it? You had the storyline. Do you immediately just continue with the storyline, or does your mind start going with, "Ooh, the world will have this," or "What if we had this
Oh,
conflict," or "What if we have these creatures or the interactions?" How does that work um, in
well,
your
for
world?
me, for me personally, I build the world as I go. Uh,
Okay.
and what I mean by that is I will pepper in little details into the world that don't really mean anything.
Mm,
And then I'll go back and say, hey, wait a minute, I put this in there. Can I do something with that? Or can I make it deeper? Or can I do, so my first draft is always a mess because there's, times where I'm talking about this thing and then I change my mind halfway through and twist it a little bit. And so the editing process is always a mess of trying to clean it up. But a great example of that between book one and book two has to do with, and this isn't too much of a spoiler because I've talked about this elsewhere about it,
okay.
but in book one, there is a mention of a group. I mentioned Day terrorists in the middle of the book. They
Mm.
did something, and when I was writing book one, Drawn in Ash, and you had come up to me and said, "What's a Day?" My response would be, "I have no idea. It's
It
I don't know
sounded
what they
really
are."
good in the
Yeah,
moment. Yeah.
exactly. It's just I hit the keyboard a couple times. That's the word that popped out, and so they're Day terror. I don't have a clue what that is. But then as I was writing book two, I realized I need a new race. I need them to do something very specific and have a role in the
Mm.
story. And I thought back and said, "Oh wait, I've got those Day terror. What's a Day? Well, maybe these are Day." And so now you have this nice connection between the two books, which now if I hadn't opened my mouth and revealed all of this, everybody would say, "Oh, you had this plan from the beginning." And I could have said, "Oh, absolutely, I had it planned from the beginning." But no, I had no idea what they were, how they would fit in, all that sort of stuff. It's just working backwards like that. So making up the story world for me is mostly just throw the characters in, see what I need to show up, and add little details where I can about history or culture or religion or technology or whatever it might be, and then just build off that and see how it all spins out.
Oh, that's so cool. Okay, that makes me feel better because my homeschooled son and I, well, he's 29 now. We're writing our first book for Enclave. It'll be out next year. Oh, that one's done. We're working on book two. But it's a historical fantasy, so it's set in World War II, but it's steampunk. So
Okay.
basically, all the history is correct. We just add dirigibles and spider tanks and all these cool things in this normal history. Like every date in there is correct, every event in there is correct. It's just we upped it. And now that we're doing book 2, I'm like, "Oh, wait, on the coffee table in this description, I just happened to be the description of the room, I mentioned this title of this book. That's gonna be a key part to this." Like, book 2,
Yeah.
I'm going back and like, "We could totally tie this in," and I'm like, "How did that work? Did my mind, like, put that there knowing it's gonna be used later, or did I know that it was there, so my mind now is tying it?" I mean, do you have the same conversations with yourself?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. I want to say there are about half a dozen details in the first book that were just throwaway details or little things that, well, another example is at one point, Everest is, oh, again, spoilers. I'm trying not to.
Yeah, I know.
Everest is in Narius's bedroom and is just looking around, and she
Mhm,
spots sort of a decorative mask sitting on a shelf. And it
mhm.
literally all it was when I was writing the scene was, well, what would a king have on his bookshelves?
Yeah.
What kind of knickknacks? And I was like, well, he probably picked this up somewhere along the line. And when I was writing book two, I was like, oh, he's in this, Narius is in this situation now. He's again, spoilers, I'm going to be really vague about it,
Yeah.
but he's having to interact with some people, and hey, that mask has something to do with what he's doing right
Mm,
now. And again, so it looks like I had it planned the whole time and all that stuff, but in reality it's just me going, hey, I remember saying something about this, just like you were saying, let's bring that into the next book and make that connection and build off of it, and it works really really well for me. Now,
yeah.
I'm not trying to downplay anybody who spends 6 months or a year creating an intricate wiki of all this technology and history and all. I know people who do that, and that's fine if that works for them, but for me it's, I have no idea what this world's going to look like, and by the time I'm done it's going to be interesting, and I don't even know what we're going to find half the time.
Yeah, I love it. I love that so much. And I think it is our mind. I don't know. I think it keeps working even when we're not working on the book and it's coming up with all these things and then we're just piecing it together. And I mean, I think God created us so much more unique and have these worlds. And I mean, Jesus told stories like everywhere he went.
Oh yeah.
Jesus told a story. Of the Bible is this long story of these multiple parts, but it's so amazing that when we can start just trusting that, like trusting it's all going to work out and we don't know how these pieces are going to come together and then they do and the books come out and it's so cool and I love that you're doing that now. I know this isn't your only series, so this is book one. You're talking
Correct.
about book two. Is there going to be more in the series?
There is, okay, so there is a novella that released about a month ago. That's just an ebook exclusive. It was part of the Kickstarter campaign.
Okay.
It was one of those things where I said, okay, so we need to raise this much. Sorry, I know we've got some sound in the background. We got tree trimmers in our backyard
Oh
hacking up our
no,
trees, and
that's
so
okay.
yeah, our beagle was very anxious to go out and see them. Anyway, that's not neither
Yeah,
here
it's
nor there.
okay.
So we've got the ebook exclusive that sort of gives the backstory for one of the characters in the first book. Just kind of
Okay.
explain who is he. It's Grand Vizier Pain, Narius's right hand man. I said he has a story to tell. I thought it was going to be, maybe 30, 40,000 words. It turned out to be 75,000 words. I was like, okay, he had a lot to
That's a
say about
full law. That's a novel. Like my
it.
guidepost biblical
Was.
novels were like 65,000. So
Yeah, it was a full on novel. I was shocked when it was done. I was like, okay, you had a lot to tell people. All right,
mhm.
sounds good. That'll be a good bonus. So we have that. There's a third and probably final book that's coming out a year from now. I just finished the first draft,
Okay.
and that is a painful mess right now because if I remember correctly, the word count came out to 190,000 words. Yeah, yeah.
Whoa.
And I
Okay,
looked
that's
at that and
that's
I said,
basically 2 more books. So
it
basically
is, it
yeah.
is. So I'm having that little debate about do I do the Harry Potter thing and split the last book into two parts and release them separately and all that sort of thing. I haven't totally figured that out yet, but I'm gonna
I
try.
mean, I would have just made that 2 books. I'm just saying
Yeah,
what I would do. I'm like, "Hey,
yeah.
I wrote 2 books here. Cool. More
Well,
than I
the
thought."
Yeah, the other problem is though is that when I was writing the third book, there were I'd say half a dozen chapters that I realized after I got done with them don't contribute anything to the
Oh,
story.
that's another
And
thing,
so
yeah.
so yeah, so I don't have any idea after I actually sit down, break out the red pen and go over it. It might be a whole lot shorter, or it could turn out to be even longer. We'll see. We'll see
Yeah.
what happens.
Yeah, and
So
for all these readers out there, they just think, "Oh, the authors, we totally know what we're doing. We sit down, we plot the whole thing, we just go from the beginning of the book to the end. It always comes out perfect."
yeah,
No, it
I wish
doesn't.
that was the way that it
I
works.
know.
I really wish it did.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so we got that. Also, I related to this series. I'm writing a series of short stories.
Okay.
The first one is out. It's for free on my website. If people go and subscribe to my newsletter, they get this free short story that's set in the same world, but it follows the adventures of an adventurer for hire and his reluctant assistant. And
Ooh,
uh, the feel that I sort of have for it is if people have watched the show Futurama, it's a
okay,
little bit like Zap Brannigan and Kif Kroker, just a
okay.
little bit. only my Zap Brannigan isn't a complete idiot. He
Yeah.
actually is competent, but he's very flamboyant, very out
Mm.
there, very strange. But he still gets the job done somehow. And his assistant is trailing along, going, "How are you doing this? How
I love
how are
it.
you?" So yeah, so I've got about 9 or 10 stories sort of planned out that I want to write over the next year or two, just to keep filling in some of the gaps of the story and explaining some stuff that happens. So
Oh, so cool. I know. Once our brain gets going, it's like people say, like, "How do you get to come up with the ideas?" I'm like, "That is not the problem. Coming up with
no,
ideas
no,
is not the problem.
yeah,
It's taking time to write all the ideas is the problem."
very
Um,
much so.
but I know there are other books that you've written.
Yes.
So tell us about some of those too.
Okay, so I've got two other series that are out. The first is my Fail State trilogy. That includes my debut novel, Fail State.
And
It's
that one won an award also.
was a finalist for the
Finest oh,
Christies.
fine. Well, okay.
So
That
yeah, so
basically, that is like, my agent says, "If you're a finalist for the Christies, you won an award," because that's the
yeah.
hardest one. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So Fail State is the story of a 16-year-old superhero who is competing on a reality TV show for a superhero license from the government.
Oh.
And and the problem is that his power can best be described as breaking stuff.
Mm.
If well, he puts out a low level energy field that just causes stuff to decay and fall apart, and he can use that to destroy things. But he also breaks electronics and all that sort of thing. So
That's my
he's
13-year-old. Like, everything is broken all the time. I'm like, "How did you break this?"
yeah. So it's very much he's very clumsy. He's very unsure of himself. All that sort of thing. The problem is he has an older brother who is the poster child for superheroes. He's strong, he's charismatic, he's handsome, he's all those sorts of things. Also on the TV show, but nobody knows that they're actually brothers because they don't advertise that, and let people know that. So what happens is Fail State winds up investigating a murder. One of their fellow contestants gets murdered,
Oh,
and yeah, and he's actually blamed for it, and so he starts to investigate the murder to try to figure out what's going on. There are two other stories that follow that. There's Fail State Legends, which is my zombie apocalypse superhero
that's
story,
awesome.
and then there's Fail State Nemesis, where Fail State has grown and matured as a hero, but now he's facing his greatest challenge ever. And again, can't go into too many details because if I start revealing what the plot's about, I'm going to start spoiling big chunks of it. So,
Yeah, so
yeah.
cool. It's so fun that, I mean, these books are so, like you talk about zombie apocalypse and all these things, but it's like your creative energy is just nature is just going out in all these other areas, and it's so cool to see that. Oh, we got a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So people like speculative fiction. If they just, like, go to your Amazon page or your website, they're just going to be able to go down this happy little rabbit trail of
Yep.
all these different stories. I
Yep.
love that.
Yeah, and then the other one is I call it the Ministrix duology. There are only two books in it. The first one is Numb, and that is the story of an assassin who, set in the far future, works for a corrupted version of the church to purge heretics and protect
Mm.
the interests of the church. And he's doesn't feel pain. He doesn't feel emotions. That's just the way that he believes God has made him. And one day he is assigned, uh, well, an assassination where he's supposed to kill a young lady. But when he sees this young lady, he feels this intense burst of emotions, which he's
Oh,
never
wow.
felt before. And he's thinking, why did that happen? And he realizes in that moment, number one, I can't kill her. But number two, if I don't kill her, I'm condemned before God. So how am I supposed what am I supposed to do about this? And so how does he
Mm.
untangle that that problem?
Oh,
So
that's super interesting.
yeah. And then the second one is set in the same story world. I call it a pseudo sequel
Uh-huh.
because it takes place after Numb, but you don't have to necessarily have read Numb to. to get into this one. That's The Hive. I call that my pregnant teenage cyborg book
Oh my goodness.
because, well, the story behind that is a couple of years ago I was at the American Christian Fiction Writers Conference, and I was pitching The Hive to different people. And apparently, within 2 days, the whole conference was buzzing about, did you hear that there's a guy here pitching a book about a pregnant teenage cyborg? Did you hear about the pregnant teenage cyborg? And
Oh my
everybody's whispering about this. And finally, somebody came to me and said, did you hear about this pregnant? And I'm like, well, I am the pregnant teenage cyborg. And so I had to
You're like
write
that
that on.
pastor over there. That
Yeah,
pastor over
exactly.
there is the one.
Yeah, yeah. And so, it's a young lady named Zane. She belongs to a cybernetic collective. She's an engineering drone. That's what she does. She's supposed to build
Mm.
things and fix things. And then one day she gets separated from her collective, and she realizes at the same time she's also pregnant. And she doesn't know why. She doesn't know how this would have happened because the collective does rent out wombs to people for designer babies and stuff like that, but she's not one of those. So why is
Oh my
she
goodness.
pregnant? And how did she get separated from the collective? And what does she do now? And so she goes off basically, and this is oversimplifying it, but she goes off to find the father. She goes off to
Mhm.
find who is the person who's responsible for me being like
Right,
this.
right.
And it turns out it's a teenage hacker, and how he got involved and all that big secret, big reveal, that sort of thing. But it's, same universe, same background. One character pops up between the two books. But that's my other series.
Oh, so interesting. Like all of them are so creative and so different. And then also, I mean, you talked about being a Lutheran pastor, which we have to bring in because how does the faith element play into these books? Because I think so many times, like, there's people we can invite them to church. They're like, no, I'm not going to come to church. But hey, you want to read this book about this pregnant teenage cyborg? And they're like, oh yeah, let me read that. I
Yeah.
mean, so let's talk about the faith and how
Sure.
you use the faith or how faith works in your stories.
Okay. Well, in terms of the fail state trilogy, fail state is a committed Christian. He goes to youth group every week when he's not out fighting crime. His brother is a committed Christian as well. One of his good friends that he makes along the way becomes a Christian with them, because he's just hanging out. It's more of an organic evangelism process where it's, there's no point in my books where it's going to be, here are the steps you take, here's the prayer you pray, anything like that. It's more just this guy hangs out with these Christians and afterwards says, yeah, I think this is for me, how, and just kind of grows into the faith himself. So it's very much just a part of who the characters are.
Yeah.
Now, there are spiritual themes woven into the books. The way that I would put it is, the first fail state book is very much an extended meditation on 1 Corinthians 12 about
Mm.
the different parts of the body and the different gifts that God gives people, and
Mhm.
how do we view ourselves and other people's gifts and that sort of a thing. But it's, instead of spiritual gifts, it's superpowers.
Yeah.
So it's,
Yeah.
a little bit more accessible for a YA readership, young adult readership, rather than, a Bible study on 1 Corinthians 12.
Yeah.
So with the Ministrix duology, it's very much about, how does power intersect with the church? What does that
Mhm.
look like? You know, how should the church look at political power and all that sort of thing? And then with Drawn in Ash, while okay, I've seen a few people who have read it and said, I don't see how this is Esther at all, except for a
Mhm.
few
Yeah, yeah.
little springboard jumping off points, and that's fair. Uh, what I basically did was I took the story of Esther and rewound it a couple of hundred years so that
Mm.
instead of it being part of the Persian Empire, it's instead part of the Babylonian Empire.
Okay, yeah.
And so it's more an alternate take on the Jewish exile after
Mm.
Jerusalem is
Mm.
destroyed. That's sort of the milieu of the characters and what they're dealing with, is, the idea of, where is God when we've been in exile for 400 years? Why did this happen to us? Why hasn't he done something about it? In the first book, Everest is very much struggling with her faith because while she's able to do these miraculous things through her magic, at the same time she's like, "What use do I have for in the books that God is called the singularity? What do I have? What do I need him for? He's the one who
Mhm.
turned his back on us. He's the one who's left us here. We're not. I'm not interested in what he has to say to me right
Yeah.
now." And so it's sort of the whole story of the trilogy has sort of been Everest working her way back and understanding this is what it means to be a child of God, even in difficult
Mm.
circumstances and situations. And when you're thrust into a situation that you never expected, what does that look like, and what might God be doing through you for other people, and how might He use those unusual circumstances?
So good. And I think one thing that the point of view of the author will always come through, whether it's a faith-based point of view, even if, like the guest said, there's no prayer, there's no conversion, no one even calls themselves a Christian, like if it's a different world, your morals, your beliefs, the how the story ends will come through. And I'm disappointed every time I read a secular book that's like, oh, this is such a good book. Okay, yeah, it's well written, but at the end, like, you just feel like there's nothing. There's no hope. There's so
Sure.
many books. Like, there's a lot of well-written books out there, but if there's nothing to take away that your soul can cling to, that you can get uplifting thoughts on or hope or understand your struggles better, then it's just words that are fancy on a page. And so I really
Yep.
think that, and I think people that say, well, I don't know, this is a Christian book because it didn't talk about them getting on their knees and praying. I guarantee if people are only reading secular books and then they pick up books, even if with those light themes, they can see them, they can feel them, like, God can work in those things, and I love that God uses authors that way. Like, some will have very clear messages that are, again, black and white conversion scenes, and some, the themes will come through. I remember talking to, Lonnie Forbes, who has since passed away, about
Mm.
her, Seventh Son series, and she talked about she wrote it for a secular publisher, and the readers were still, and it was about a Mesoamerica culture, and the readers are like, "So this book is too Christian," and she's like,
Yeah.
she couldn't hide it. Like her point of view and her messages are still going to come because that's who she is, and she was trying to reach people and share truth with people that would never ever pick up anything that seemed like a Christian, and they were still saying the book was too Christian. So our messages, our themes will come through, and I love that we can do it in a way that gets people that they wouldn't even consider maybe going to church or having a conversation, thinking of it, truth and light and darkness and all these themes that are so important to us with our Christian faith.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting how that kind of sneaks through and just
Mhm.
shines through in some way, shape, or form. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Okay. Well, I've enjoyed this so much. I have two more questions. First of
Okay.
all, what's a Christian novel that you've enjoyed? It can be recently, it could be in the past, just something that you're like,
Okay.
oh, this is a great book.
All right. I'm going to recommend an author who's written a bunch of books that I've really gotten a lot out of. Unfortunately, the quality has gone down the more books he's
Mm,
written, so that I'm just going to recommend three of them. And
okay.
if you want to dip your toe into the other ones, go ahead.
Yeah.
But they're not as good. And that's Dr. Paul Meyer. He's
Mm.
actually a biblical historian, and so he wrote two novels back in the 70s called Pontius Pilate and the Flames of Rome.
Oh, okay.
And his rule was, and this is what made these fascinating, was he said, I am going to try to be as historical as possible. If I don't know that it happened, I'm not going to make it up. I'm
Oh,
only
okay.
I'm only going to fill in the blanks where I feel that I absolutely have to, but I'm going to keep the artistic, license to a minimum. And it's only stuff that I can prove. It's only stuff that's been documented. It's only all that sort of stuff. Dialogue might not, got to make up dialogue and stuff like
Right,
that.
right.
And so it's the story of Pontius Pilate and his career and what he went through as the governor of Judea, and then the story of Rome burning in the 60s. And it's all very, very well done. I mean, he has footnotes at the back that are almost as long as the book itself, where he
Wow.
says, this is where this detail comes from. This is how we know this is the case. This is how, and it's just super fascinating stuff. And then for a long time, one of my favorite Christian novels was a book that he wrote called A Skeleton in God's Closet, where
Okay.
the basic premise is, what if a group of archaeologists were digging in Israel and they came across Jesus' body? So
Mm.
they're excavating a site and they come across a tomb and they find what looks like definitive proof that this is actually the body of Jesus Christ buried where nobody would expect it, but here's the reasons why. What would that look like? What would happen in the world? All that sort of thing. And it's amazing. It's such a detailed, scientific, archaeologically sound book. And it's surprisingly uplifting and
Mm.
fulfilling reading it because, spoiler, it's not really, but,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, and now he's tried to write some other fiction since then, sequels to A Skeleton in God's Closet. And there have been times where, and I read the two sequels and I was like, okay, it's time to stop. It's time to stop. This
Yeah.
is the quality's going down. But those three books are really, really excellent.
Oh, so cool. I've not heard of those, so we'll definitely check those out. So thank you
Right?
for that. Okay, and then also last question, where can people go to connect with you? You mentioned your website, you mentioned story that you have there. So
Yep.
share all the information.
Okay, so my website is johnwotte.com. So JOHNWOTTE, all one word.com. Uh, all the information about my books, other anthologies, my defunct blog that I haven't updated in like 3 years is there. So, I mean, you can go poke through that if you want to. But there is the sign up to get the free short story Cage and the Outpost of Monolith. That's the short story that I mentioned earlier. I have a Facebook author page that I sometimes remember to update. I have a Twitter page where you'll mostly see me either arguing with people about Star Wars or or sharing my daily Wordle scores.
Oh, that's
And
awesome.
then I have an Instagram account that has pictures of books and also board games that I'm playing.
I
So,
love all the board games. We'll
yep.
check that
So
out.
yeah, so if you can find me just about anywhere, and I think I have links for all of that stuff on my website. So if you go there, you can find me pretty much everywhere else.
I love it. Well, here is the book again, Drawn in Ash, John W. Otte. So thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely, it was my pleasure.